Hello and welcome back. This is the week 4 lecture. So today we're talking about poetry. So as I mentioned last week, we have three traditional categories of literature that we're going to be covering. We started last week with fiction, and that included novels and short stories. Now this week we're talking about poetry, and next week we will conclude with drama. So as I mentioned when we were discussing fiction, drama and poetry are the older forms of literature. They've been around a lot longer. Fiction is relatively new and recent in comparison. Novels have been around for maybe 400 years now, but in the English language tradition, really more like 300 years, and then short stories are really only about 200 years old, in the fashion that we know them today. So fiction really hasn't been around that long, comparatively speaking, but it has sort of experienced this, meteoric rise. It's become kind of the dominant form of literature in our contemporary time. But we have to, pay our respect to poetry and drama, even if we don't like these forms as much, even if we might not enjoy reading them as much as fiction. But of course, there are exceptions. We might have some real poets. We might have some people who like to read poetry. It's not like poetry has gone away. It's still with us. It's still an important literary format. It's just, less popular now than it was in earlier historical periods. And I know in the context of English class and a lot of academic situations, students can sometimes be a little bit intimidated by poetry or just a little bit, uncertain about approaching poetry because there can sometimes be a sense that it's difficult to understand poetry, or it might be more difficult to read. Again, I'm speaking generally. I'm sure not all of us feel this way, but maybe some of us have felt this way, at least at certain times in the past when confronted with poetry. So I would like to demystify poetry a little bit today, if possible. That might not be necessary for all of us, but if any of us are feeling a little apprehensive or a little bit of trepidation about jumping into poetry, I would like to sort of address that. Hopefully we can address that by covering the main sort of most important poetic elements for us, just like we did last week with the key elements of fiction. I think if we're able to start breaking poems down into their smaller parts, we can better understand how they work. So we're not going to get too much into history today. I'll mention a few things, but again, just for perspective, just for the sake of comparison, we talked a little bit about the history of fiction last week. So just keep in mind that when we're talking about poetry and drama sort of in Western culture, we really go back to antiquity. We go back to ancient times. I mean, these art forms have really existed essentially as long as recorded history. So much, much older than fiction. So we go back to ancient Greece, ancient Rome, particularly Greece, when we're looking for sort of the origins of, Western poetry, the kind of poetry that would later influence the literature of Europe and, of course, the Americas. So, we got to go back to ancient times, and we think, a lot of historians have sort of hypothesized that what we think of as poetry might have grown out of sort of ancient Greek festivals and rituals where there would have been music and feasting and, in some cases, dramatic performances. Some of the origins of drama can be found around that same period. And then also there would have been, some readings of poetry or perhaps performances. There might have been some musical accompaniment. I think certain parts of ancient Greek poetry were typically sung, and then other parts would have just been recited, much in the way that people still recite poetry today. So I'm not sure. I'm no historian. I'm no expert on ancient Greece, but we do sort of trace the origins all the way back to those ancient times, and then poetry remained popular, at least in Europe and Western Europe, throughout the medieval period. So it's been with us really for a long time, but as I mentioned, maybe it has declined a bit in popularity. People still read poetry, but not as often, not as many people probably read it as once did. But I want to talk about some of the most important elements today, and I also want us to practice a little bit of scansion. I want us to scan a line. I'll explain what that means. I want us to just take the first line of Annabelle Lee, one of the assigned poems for this week, and just break it down a little bit to better understand the meter and to better understand aspects of rhythm and sound, which are very important when we're analyzing poetry, as they mention in the book. That's a key way that poetry differs from prose. Remember last week I talked about fiction being written in prose, right? Prose is what we find in novels and short stories. It's kind of everyday speech oftentimes. It often sounds a lot like everyday speech. It will often be dialogue heavy. There'll be description and exposition provided by our narrator, like we talked about last week. But oftentimes prose is going to at least sort of approximate normal human speech. Now, of course, if we read old prose, an old novel from the 17 or 1800s, of course the language is going to feel, outdated, sort of archaic, and sort of alien and somewhat unfamiliar to us. But it would have been pretty realistic speech for that time period, most likely. So we're pretty comfortable with prose, generally speaking. We encounter prose a lot. Most things are written in prose, not just short stories or novels, but like a news article, anything that you would find on a website, in a newspaper, in a magazine, that's all prose, right? We generally read prose. And there are many people who only want to read prose, and that's fine if you're one of those people, but we have to at least sort of understand some of the basic differences that we find in verse. And verse is what we find in poetry. So it's just different, right? And we know that it sounds different, it often looks different, and it's often constructed in a very different way from what we would see in prose. So we'll cover some of that today as well. But yeah, let's just start moving through some of the key elements, and then we'll visit Annabelle Lee to help us a little bit with meter. So it might help if you guys could pull that poem up or open up your books. That's a very easy poem to find online, but of course it's also in our book. So let's start with just basically the elements that they cover in the book. The book does not always provide a great deal of detail, so I would like to fill in a little bit, but let's start with the speaker. And this should remind us a little bit of an element that we were talking about last week in relation to fiction. So with poetry, we have to think about the speaker as being the person who is speaking the words of the poem. As simple as that. You have to ask yourself, who is speaking here? Who is speaking in the poem? Where is the speaker located? And what might be the speaker's state of mind or situation or circumstance in life? So remember last week we talked about narrators, and we talked about the different kinds of narrative point of views that we can find in fiction. We can get a first-person narrator where, a protagonist or the main character of a story is telling that story. We might also get an omniscient third-person narrator, a godlike narrator who knows everything about all the characters. Or we might get one of those weird limited third-person narrators. So there's always going to be a narrator when we're reading prose. It's just a question of who the narrator is, what kind of narrator is it, what do we think about that narrator, because of course some narrators are going to be reliable, some are unreliable. We didn't talk about that last week, but you should keep that in mind with both fiction and poetry. Our narrators or our speakers can't always be trusted. Just like regular people, some are reliable and some are not. So when we're talking about poetry, we use different terminology. We don't typically refer to narrators, we refer to speakers. But the function, the role being performed is very similar for both of those. So the speaker is functioning much like a narrator would in fiction. So in some cases, the speaker of a poem might just be, the voice of the poet. In some cases, that's true, because most of the poetry, at least that we're reading, is lyric poetry, which means it's short, and it's usually centered around a particular idea or an impression or an experience. Lyric poetry tends to be pretty short and often not really narrative. We have another category for narrative poetry. And we talked a little bit about that last week with the ancient epics of the Greeks and Romans, which, that's verse, that's poetry, but some people compare those to modern novels because of their big scope, their huge cast of characters, their elaborate plots, and everything else. But poems really can be super long and they can tell stories. We do have narrative poetry, and that's still around today, although less popular probably than it once was. But I don't think we're really reading anything that would truly be considered narrative poetry. I mean, a lot of poems tell stories, so don't feel like lyric poetry can't tell a story, but the focus more often for lyric poetry is on impressions, sensations, experiences, and emotions. So certain events are being retold, things might be happening. That's why we can still summarize a poem, we can still talk about the plot of a poem, but with lyric poetry, we're not as focused on the narrative and having a really well-developed, fleshed-out narrative. Typically, narrative poetry would be a bit longer. And, for the sake of time, we're not really getting into a lot of that. But again, for some, particularly some short lyric poems, it's just maybe the speaker really is just the poet's voice. The poet's just observing something, saying something. It might be as simple as that, but a lot of times the speaker will be a character. Like, the speaker won't just be the poet. Just like if you're reading a first-person narrative in prose, that first-person narrator isn't necessarily the author of the book talking. Maybe in some ways it is, but a lot of times that narrator is a separate character. It's a creation of the author, just like the other characters are. So that same thing can hold true in poetry. A lot of speakers are invented by the poet. The speaker is a character. The speaker can often be analyzed and sort of explored further. Sometimes it's very separate from the actual poet, the actual personality of the poet. So you kind of have to be alert to signs in the poem. Try to learn as much as you can about the speaker. Are there any details given about the speaker? If the speaker is, talking about where they are, what they're doing, who they are, how old they are, what their station in life might be. Pay attention to that stuff, because that's often going to be important. See if the speaker kind of reveals their identity or if it remains somewhat mysterious. Often in lyric poetry, we're not quite sure who the speaker is. We can make some educated guesses. We can, we can assume or know certain things, but we might not totally know the identity. But sometimes we can figure it out. So think about the speaker, and then also think about the listener. So this is a little odd, but a lot of times poems will be addressed to particular people, or they'll have what's called an implied reader or an implied listener, who is sort of supposed to be like the intended recipient of the text. Now, not all poems work this way, but we can often find what the book calls an I-you relationship between the speaker, who might be sort of a surrogate for the poet, or might be a character created by the poet. And so that the speaker is the I, and then the speaker is addressing the listener you. I'm talking to you. And even if that listener or that reader isn't like a real person, this gets kind of weird. Like when we talk about the implied reader, that means it's not a real person necessarily, but it's the type of person that the poet wants to talk to or the speaker wants to talk to. An implied reader is kind of like a stand-in for the type of person who would be reading this or is similar to maybe the person that the speaker has in mind. So it can get a little weird, but there's sometimes going to be someone addressed by the speaker. And sometimes that's made evident in the poem. Sometimes the speaker is very explicit about who they are addressing. They might even refer to them by name. In other cases, we might be able to figure it out. So yeah, just think about that I-you relationship. Notice when you find a poem with that, where the speaker is basically assuming an I-you relationship with the listener or the reader. But some poems aren't like that. A lot of lyric poems don't have a specific addressee. They don't have a specific reader or listener in mind. Instead, the poet or the speaker, to be more accurate, the speaker is speaking more generally or speaking sort of philosophically. They're not addressing a particular person, but they're just making maybe more general observations, or they're sharing certain experiences or certain thoughts and ideas. So you should notice the difference between a poem where somebody is being specifically addressed versus the poems where the speaker seems to be speaking in a more general, philosophical, observational kind of way, or even a confessional kind of way, talking about the speaker's own experiences, but just perhaps sharing them with everyone, or do they mean to share those experiences with a particular person? Sometimes you, as the reader, sort of get to decide based on clues you find and based on your analysis and interpretation. Okay, another key element to be aware of, and you've probably learned this before if you've taken me in 101. I know we talked about it, but it's good to refresh your memory because this is very important when it comes to poetry. Imagery. Okay, imagery just means words and phrases that tap in to our our five senses, our sensory impressions. So typically, as the word sort of suggests, when we talk about imagery, we typically refer to images. Words or phrases that engage readers' sense of sight. So sometimes we'll call this sort of, drawing mental pictures for the reader, for the audience. So making the reader see whatever is being described on the page. If there's action taking place on a beach, you want the reader to see the water, see the sand, see the characters standing there in this beautiful scenery. So we find imagery all the time in all kinds of literature. So don't be confused. We find it in fiction too. We find plenty of imagery in fiction. We'll find it in drama. We can find it everywhere. But we find it a lot in poetry. Poetry leans even more heavily on stuff like imagery and figurative language than, say, fiction does, right? In large part, that's because, again, if we're talking about lyric poetry, we're talking about short texts oftentimes. They're often going to be shorter than a short story and certainly shorter than a novel. So, and with less emphasis on narrative, remember, a lot of lyric poetry wants to emphasize a feeling, an impression, maybe an image or a collection of images. So there's going to be more emphasis on imagery because sometimes that's the whole ball game. Whereas in fiction, the imagery is sort of supplemental. It's usually being used by a narrator oftentimes to describe something, but that's just kind of a tool often to progress the narrative or to explain what the characters are doing, or whatever. Whereas in poetry, sometimes it can be the whole focus. Language. right? The different sort of features of language become a lot more noticeable and in some cases more important to talk about when we're analyzing poetry. So that's definitely true with imagery. So again, sometimes it'll be a single word, in other cases a phrase or maybe a sentence or two that's just making you see something, but also as the reader, but also maybe helping you to hear something or smell something. Remember, we have 5 senses. Sight is not the only one, and technically imagery can sort of tap into any of our senses. So that means sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. So when you're reading, you might come across words or phrases that help to engage those senses. Not literally, but if it's effective on the page, it's going to at least make you think of that sensory impression. It's going to remind you of a time where maybe you tasted a similar flavor or maybe you heard a similar sound. And that's what good poetry does. Imagery is very important, and most poets are using it at least to some degree. So we should be pretty comfortable looking for imagery and talking about it because we've probably talked about it in the past in previous contexts. So it's no different now. But again, just think about all of your senses. You can obviously focus on sight first and foremost, but don't forget about the other senses as well. But now I want to turn to an element that's kind of unique to poetry. In some cases, it will show up in drama, but it's not really a big part of fiction. So now we come to one of those big divides, one of those kind of moments where we see the separation or the difference between prose and verse, right? So with poetry, we're going to have we have to pay attention to a certain degree to sound and rhythm. And we really have to look for patterns. And a lot of those patterns are going to affect the sound, the experience that we have of listening or hearing the poem, how it sounds when we read it, how it sounds maybe if we listen to it. And this is a big part of what makes verse different from prose. Prose can often sound very melodic, very pleasing to the ear, but prose often does not have as much of a sound element. Because, as we're about to find out, there are certain things that we find in poems that just aren't really operative in fiction. So stuff like rhyme scheme, meter, stanzas, all these things to do with poems that we're going to be talking about in a few moments, we don't see those in fiction. At least not with the same kind of regularity. So fiction tends to have fewer sound patterns. Because again, in everyday speech, we don't always use a lot of sort of specific sound effects. Sometimes we'll do it unintentionally, but we don't always sound very poetic when we talk. And prose, in its pursuit of realism, which is often, like we talked about last week, prose is often trying to be realistic. As a result, prose can sometimes be described as more sort of utilitarian, more practical. But don't get me wrong, a lot of prose can still sound very beautiful, but it's not going to follow some of these same rules concerning sounds and patterns that we find in poetry. So let's get into some of that, because that's the hard stuff with poetry, right? We can typically appreciate imagery, we can think about speakers, we can think about listeners, and when we do get a hold of a poem that seems to be telling a story, we can use our fiction reading ability to do some of that same kind of analysis that we might do with a short story. We can think about the plot, we can think about characters, we can think about theme. We're usually pretty comfortable doing that kind of work with poetry. But where poetry gets difficult is when we really get into aspects of sound and rhythm and all of those kinds of patterns. So I want to try to demystify it a little bit today. But what I think would probably be best is if I just stop part 1 here, because we're close to a half hour, and let's just come back in part 2, and we're going to talk a little bit more about rhyme, assonance, consonants, Certainly meter, we're not going to get too bogged down in meter, but I'm going to try to explain it briefly. We'll talk about stanzas and other aspects of poetic form. Okay, that will be part 2. I'll make it painless, and then that will be it. So join me for part 2.